Good evening. Nice to see you all here. I'm Don Mansfield. I am the chair of the Department of Environmental Studies at the College of Idaho, and I'd like to welcome you to our 5th annual Henberg Environmental Lecture. The lecture was started by Marv Henberg and his wife Laurie. Marv is with us in the audience tonight. When Marv retired from the presidency a few years back, he and Laurie left a gift of endowment to support an ongoing annual lecture, and you're in it. The purpose of the Henberg Environmental Lecture is to bring prominent figures, experts in the field of environmental studies to communicate conversation and stimulate conversation related to important environmental challenges of our time. Many people have brought this evening event possible, made it possible. Thanks are extended to the Office of the Co-Presidents at the College of Idaho, the Orma J. Smith Museum of Natural History, the Office of Events and Conference Services, thanks Adam, the Faculty of Environmental Studies Department, and finally to our partner at Boise State University, the Idea of Nature series. At this point, I'd like to invite Dr. Tim Otter, a former professor of biology and corporate grants officer at the College of Idaho a few years back, to introduce Dr. Bernd Heinrich, our evening speaker, longtime colleague of Tim. Tim, it's up to you.
Oh gosh, this is exciting for me for many reasons. One is that, as Don mentioned, I met Bernd in 1986 when I came to the University of Vermont as a junior faculty member, and spent several years there working on, we never really did any research together or anything like that. And then after I moved to Vermont from Vermont to Idaho in 1993, a few years after that, I was fortunate enough to be asked to co-direct the Wittenberger writing project for high school teachers. And for the first 2 years that I was the director there, 1998 and 99, Bernd Heinrich and Barry Tolkien were the two guest instructors in the writing project. And it was then that I really got to see what it was like to be in the field doing things with Bernd Heinrich. So the other thing that I realized just now as I was sitting there is that the last time that I was on this stage and doing anything like this, talking into a microphone, was when I gave my sabbatical presentation back in 1805, I don't know when it was, but it was a long time ago. So I want to keep my comments short because we're here to listen to what Bernd has to say. But as I thought about the way I would like to introduce him, I thought that I would not focus on the honors, awards, and accolades he has received, but instead, I thought I would try to help you appreciate Bernd's approach to the study of nature. When I made that choice, I thought, well, how can I do that? How can I describe it adequately, and what should I call it? The problem is that Bernd is a superb biologist, an accomplished writer, a gifted artist and illustrator. So his work spans art, literature, and science. And this makes it hard to just sort of apply standard terms to him and say exactly who is Bernd, what is Bernd. So I'm going to start out with a brief quotation from a book I just received and started reading. I'm still at the end of chapter 1. This book is called This Is Your Brain on Music. And the epigraph in here is from Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Now, are you familiar with Sapolsky? He's a neuroscientist at Stanford University. So Sapolsky says this: I love science, and it pains me to think that so many are terrified of the subject or feel that choosing science means you cannot also choose compassion or the arts or be awed by nature. Science is not meant to cure us of mystery, but to reinvent and reinvigorate it. So for me, the key words in that passage are awe, awed by nature, and mystery. And so to close my introductory comments, I want to share some excerpts of a letter that Bernd wrote me dated June 18th, 1997, the year before he came here as a guest instructor in the Wittenberger Project. And in this letter, he speaks about forging a deep, abiding connection with living things and natural processes via discovery. So this is from Bernd's letter. Dear Tim, I think I'm basically an artist, though not in the sense of producing original art. I see art in nature, and it can't be improved upon, only found. Nowadays, though, in science, it seems the emphasis is on method, towing the line, rather than solving mysteries. As a little kid, I used to draw to preserve images or discovers. Later, I got, by pure happenstance, to look beyond the images of nature, but they still had to be preserved somehow. Precision of language was required for scientific papers, no less than precision of brushstrokes or pencil. And when I see something wonderful, whether on the surface or at the level of mechanism below it, then I want to preserve it, either keep it or pass it on. I'm not sure there's a difference, because one can't pass anything on till one first grasps and holds it. So please, with deepest admiration and appreciation, let's give a warm welcome to Bernd Heinrich.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for having me here, and I want to especially thank Rochelle for making it all possible. And I know I've met dear old friends, and it's nice to see them again, and also to make new friends. And so I'm very happy to be here, and I wasn't quite sure about the title or what I was going to talk about, to tell you the truth. But I want to tell you that Tim got close to what I really wanted to talk about. It kind of started yesterday, coming here on the plane from Chicago. I was sitting next to a woman who just came from South America somewhere, and she is in a health profession of some kind. And so we got to talking, and she wondered, what I was doing. And I said, I was going to Boise and to give a talk. And so it came out basically that I said, okay, why am I doing it? Well, I guess I'm a writer. So what do you write? I said, well, I wrote about birds and bees and beetles and flowers. And so she kind of was taken aback, and she said, well, I really I'm not that much interested in facts, So that kind of stopped the conversation with me. But I was thinking I'm interested in facts, but mostly because they connect to stories. So you have facts, and you put them together, and they connect, and you get a story. And to me, the most exciting story is one that's been going on for 3.4 billion years, and that's the story of life, of nature. So that's a story I'm interested in, and it's got very many dimensions, and we're all part of it too. But the thing is that stories change. Our stories keep changing, and we've had stories since we first walked on two legs, and we're hunters, and there are always changes in our views of nature, and those views depend on facts. Increasing facts happen, through our knowledge, and so more knowledge basically mean more facts, and they change what we see, and the knowledge comes from contact. So it requires contact to get the knowledge, and with the contact, then there comes empathy as well. For example, if you're talking about animals, you learn, what they're like, and from that empathy becomes appreciation, and from the appreciation, we see the value, and we see our stake in it, and in nature, for example, and so we want to protect it. And so then our emphasis and actions to it are more appropriate and not misplaced. Like empathy potentially can be misplaced. For example, my son was in a nature camp, and he picked up this beautiful beetle, and he wanted to take it home. And the instructor says, no, you cannot touch nature. You put it back down. I think that is totally inappropriate message, because it removes the reason for being interested in that beetle. And what the emphasis should be on ecology. It should be on the big picture. And the same goes for many issues that relate to the environment. And So there is a danger for the stories to our disconnect from nature, our increasing disconnect from nature, with less and less people having direct contact. That is one of the problems. And it leads to a physical separation from us and the rest of the world. And nature becomes more and more abstract the more we are removed from it and not in actual contact with it. And I think it is a danger of resulting in kind of a mechanical, simplified view of nature. And so I don't want to get into too theoretical here and abstract. And so I decided to talk about what actually came up in our discussion this morning in the class with Rochelle, and we were talking about what were my specific influences. As an example of how was it that I wrote a whole bunch of scientific papers on all these different things. I mean, I don't I had to step back myself and think about it. I mean, in retrospect, it's not something that ever I would have expected, especially becoming a writer. That's sort of the last thing I ever thought of. I was a scientist for a very long time before I ever did any writing at all. But of course, doing science, you have to write up the results. That results in a technical writing, but it's different than for a more general audience. So now I'd like to start and talk about influences. And one of my first influences was my father. And he was sort of at the tail end of the era where we saw nature as looking at nature in all the diversity. And so here we see him, okay, press that. Okay, here we go, I'm sorry, now I got it. So this is my father, and he is holding one bird, and here he is holding, this is Stresemann. He is an ornithologist at the University of Berlin, and he was friends with Leonard Sanford at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and these two professors, they decided to send my father out to Indonesia to try to find this rail bird that superficially looks sort of something like a Virginia rail, and it was thought to be extinct for about 60 years, and they wanted to see if he could find it, so he must have made a reputation for collecting birds for the museum, and he was sent, and this is him again, as a rat catcher. So he was not only collecting birds, he was collecting rats, small rodents for the museum. But he had helpers. Here is his wife on the right and her sister, and they were doing the skinning and the stuffing of the birds. And here is that bird which was thought to be extinct, and it took them 2 years. They were in the jungle nonstop without being away for 2 years when they finally got it. So it's still there, and we can read reports of it now. So it wasn't extinct, and so that was sort of a start, and that allowed him to pursue his hobby, which sort of became his profession. Now, there wasn't any money available for his real love, which is collecting wasps. To do that, he had to collect birds, and he had to collect very special birds, and in some cases he did. As a matter of fact, this is a thrush, a new species that came from Angola. So he was in Angola for a year with my mother, and they brought back this bird, rather spectacular. So what he was really interested in was these insects. These are Ignorin wasps. They parasitize Lepidoptera. This is these are drawings from one of his publications of Ignorin wasps from Madagascar. They're about this subfamily Ignorinae that he was interested in. There were about 60,000 species estimated, and he named, had new species, I think 1,400 new species. Anyway, this is just some that I collected right in Maine, just around the cabin, just to be able to show them. I mean, I didn't prepare them anything. I have no idea what the species are. But this is how the new species were described. Now, I just want to make the point that hardly anybody would know what the species are, because when you read those descriptions of Pedinopelti orientalis, what the heck is that? And you read the description, you're not going to be able to place it with what it was, if there are thousands. So anyway, so here is now somebody in Russia who is taking up on this project, and Alexander Tereshkin, and he's making computer drawings that are standardized and that highlight the species differences, and so we can see this combined with art. So if Audubon had been an Ignumon specialist, we probably would know all kinds of them, but we don't. Okay, so this is where I come in. We were in a cabin after the end of the Second World War in the woods there near Hamburg, and we lived there in this cabin about a mile and a half away from a little village, and we, went back and forth to school from there for 5 years, and I got my nature fix initially with birds. So here's my crow, Jakob, took from the nest and raised it, and it grew up and then eventually became wild. But my hobby was the carabid beetles, and here's a sketch of me hacking open a stump, and I found the beetle, and my father was very he wanted the beetle too, because we didn't have any money, so he was selling some of these specimens to museum, but I was collecting them and wanted it, and this picture is a photograph of that cabin where we lived, and I went there a few years ago, and I remember the precise spot almost. It's over in this direction, about 100 feet, where I found an Ignorin wasp for him. And so this was a one with the yellow spots, and I remember how beautiful it was, and I know this is where I kind of started, because I know how old I was, because he's got the date on there, 1945, September, and he had a G and he changed it to a B, so it signifies that I had found it. So yeah, so I started with insects, and to get these wasps, another way, rather than just looking for them in hibernation, is to get them from caterpillars. So here's Saturniid caterpillars, and I was very much enamored by hunting caterpillars. And we would raise them. These are all Americans, though, not Europeans, but still raise them to see if a moth would come out, or if a Ignorin wasp, or a moth would come out. So I was quite enamored with caterpillars, and at UCLA, when I was there fishing around for a Ph.D. project, one of the things I got interested in was these tomato hornworms. And this is Solanum dulcimera. It's a Jimson weed, and it's a typical moth-adapted flower. It's got the long corolla, and only the sphinx moth with a very long tongue could reach down there. So it's the same idea that Charles Darwin found that predicted a big species of sphinx moth. I think it was in Madagascar, because they found this flower with this incredibly long corolla, and they knew that it had to be adapted for some kind of a moth, and that could only be a sphinx moth, and they later on actually found it. So anyway, I was interested in how the caterpillar ate the leaf. Now, you see here, it related to how the caterpillar survived in the desert, because it was really hot there, and the sun was coming down really brightly, and how were they not drying up? So they would, of course, be eating leaves, but there's hot winds, and there's bright sunshine coming down. And also, I noticed that they were paring down the leaf, and even while they were under it. And when I started raising them on tobacco leaves, which are huge leaves in comparison, I found that they could take a leaf and eat the whole leaf without dropping any of it, without moving from the spot. So they could sit under the leaf at the petiole and eat the whole leaf and use it the whole time as a potential shield, and wouldn't waste any of it. So I actually wrote and I thought, I was interested in how they would handle different leaf shapes. So I would cut the leaf like tobacco leaves in long strips, or have them different shapes, and the caterpillars could always stay in place and eat the whole thing. So this was really my first paper in Behavioral Journal. I published it in Animal Behavior, and it was accepted. It's a very simple little question, and had a very simple answer how this beetle, these caterpillars could do it with very specific responses that allowed them to do it. That's something that looks like it might be intelligent behavior, but that can be explained in simple mechanical means. Okay, so this led up then, I totally forgot about it, until a few summers later. I was at the Minnesota field station in Itasca and happened to be walking along a path, and I saw a leaf, a fresh leaf in the summertime lying on the path, and it had a short petiole, so it looked like the petiole had broken off, but I could tell it was chewed off, and the leaf was only partially eaten. So here was a caterpillar that was wasting leaf, and apparently going to great trouble to waste the leaf because it had to chew through it to get it to drop off. So this led then to a study with birds, actually, because when I really looked at it in more detail, I found here, so here is a caterpillar. This is a Catocala moth caterpillar, and here's a leaf, a big leaf of a basswood. It would have gone way down here, but it's going to the trouble of chewing through this hard petiole, doing a lot of work to get rid of it. Well, the long story is that, there has to be some reason to go into all this work just to get rid of that leaf. And the prediction was, as you might suspect, that it was getting rid of the feeding evidence, and that is because the idea I got just from hunting for caterpillars, which is by looking at where there's leaf damage. And so it turned out that we could test chickadees and found out that we could train them to go to trees in an aviary that had holes punched into them. And they would then immediately go there, and so they're using feeding damage to hunt for leaves. So one thing, leads to another, just logically. There isn't any plan ahead. It's just from making careful observations, simply from a dropped leaf, for example, and then going on. So anyway, the caterpillars now, of course, eclosed into moths. So these are the white-lined sphinx moth. And just about that time at UCLA, there was this paper that came out in Nature that professed to show that these moths regulated their body temperature at about the same temperature we do in flight, their thoracic temperature. And how did they do it? Well, they said when it's cold, they produce more heat to keep the body temperature up. And when it's When it's hot in the air, then they produce less heat, so they maintain the same temperature, the same way you regulate your thermostat in a house. Well, it turned out that was totally wrong. They did regulate their temperature, but they didn't do it that way. They regulated instead the rate of heat loss. And so the caterpillars led to the moths, and that led to this physiological mechanism, which really was very exciting for me, because nobody had ever seen anything like that for the circulatory system of an insect. And this led to all kinds of other insects. And for example, it led to my studies with bumblebees. And bumblebees, this is a common one in California, Bombus wasnessensky, and they make a little, this is a queen that comes out of hibernation in the spring, and they make a clump where they put pollen and honey, and then they lay their eggs in there, and then they drape themselves across it, and then what they do is they shiver with their flight muscles. The wings stay perfectly unmoving. It's like an automobile that the motor is going full blast, but the clutch is in, so it's not, the wings are not engaged, so producing heat, and then they're dumping the heat into the abdomen, and the abdomen is bare on the bottom. It's applied to this, and we could show that it was incubating the brood and keeping it warm. And in this way, when it's cold, like here in the northern area too, they would incubate the eggs just like a bird does, and allow them to hatch and the colony to grow throughout the early season, when normally they would not grow. So here's just looking at the mechanism. So as I said, I was interested in physiology. So here's a cross-section. So here is the so-called heart of the bee, and the same in the moth. And you notice how it makes a loop here, and this is where the heat is produced. Now, this loop looked like it was specifically designed to pick up heat, to increase the surface area. Okay, so the blood goes through here, then the head, and then it percolates through, and it's now heated in here, and it drifts down here. And now what you see is a counter-current heat exchanger. Here is a cold blood from the abdomen going back in the heart here. So the heat from here is recaptured here and is recycled, a lot of it. However, they can also bypass that. So this blood here goes through here in pulses, so they can bypass it and maintain the abdomen cold, even with the same heat production. So what happens here is one pulse of warm blood goes this way, and then the hot blood goes that way. One goes this way, one that way. So they go back and forth. So this pulse of blood came from the thorax, went here when this was up, and so there was no counter-current heat exchanger. So the same anatomy can produce something totally different. So I was, this was very exciting, and it just kind of opened up everything, and that led to ecology of the bees in the field and the energy expenditure. And this is a common species, would be here too, Bombus ternarius. And that led to relationships with plants, because these bees now are pollinating the flowers. And here I sketched out, what might be found out in the field at any one time. And I looked at the ecology, like a mountain meadow, for example. There would be all kinds of different flowers, and the bees have choice as to which flowers to go to. And it takes skill to manipulate the flowers, because in some, they have to go way down to the bottom to get the nectar. In some, there isn't any nectar, there's only pollen. In some, the nectar is way up here, and they have to be able to know that it's up there and find it. And here, it is way up there. So they're all of different morphologies and different colors and different scents. So the bees learn by individual initiative what's out there. And so that then resulted in the question of coevolution. How do the bees affect the ecology of the plants? And so that then led to bumblebee economics. But I was still really interested in birds. I haven't quite forgotten birds. As I said, I started out with crows, and this is at the farm there near Farmington, Maine, when we first came, and I had this pet crow. And a little later, here, again, pet crows up at the cabin where I am now. This was 40 years ago, actually. And I had some crows to raise, and also had a great horned owl, which is sketched here. And I wanted to see, why owls and crows seem to hate each other, because whenever the crows around home would see an owl, there would be a huge commotion, and crows from all over the place would come screeching in, and they would mob it. But I found that with the owl, they eventually got them to get along. What happened was the owl would always watch the crows and would only try to attack it when the crow wasn't looking. So in the crows were now getting very careful. After one got caught and then I released it, it was okay. But after that, they would watch the owl all the time, and the crow would know it was being watched. And pretty soon they would just, they'd follow me down to the stream, both the crows and the owl, and they were totally at peace with each other. So I learned there was a lot of learning involved there. Can't make just a generalization. So these are some crows I had just a couple of years ago. Again, young ones, and it's a lot of fun to have crows. They follow you around all over the place, even to the outhouse. And here's one singing, and I had heard singing before when I had crows when I was little, but I never thought too much about it. But now I seem to notice it all of a sudden. They go, just like that. And they do that for many minutes at a time. And they do it all by themselves. So I don't know exactly what it means, but they certainly do the singing behavior. And I think I call it just vocal play. They explore everything physically with their beaks, and they're just having fun. Okay, you may have read Ravens in Winter, and here's a photograph I had that represents the interesting problem, which was why ravens would be found in groups together when normally you would think of them fighting viciously to maintain a big food bonanza. Why would they want to share it? And it looked like they were sharing, and I wanted to find out whether or not they were actually sharing it. Why were they sharing it? Because when you look around, you very seldom saw a raven, and once in a while a pair, but once you put out a big bait, very often, suddenly there would be a dozen or more. So I had to do a lot of field work and also look at them from up close and really get to know them. A lot of these studies requires that one really know the animals from up close, and so that when you're watching them, they're not paying any attention to you, because normally if they weren't tame, you wouldn't really know what their behavior is, because you would be affecting it. So I had to hand raise them so they wouldn't be affected by me. He made a sketch of White Wing and Goliath, a pair that paired up in the huge aviary that was probably the aviary is probably about 3 times as big as this auditorium to try to simulate wild conditions. And having the birds there where I knew what their prior experience was because I raised some from babies in the aviary, and knowing what they could be programmed for genetically. For example, they would never have food suspended from a string. However, some ravens, could, when you had food on a string, they would go down, reach down, pull it up, and put the string onto the branch, put one foot on it, then release, and then go down again and pull up, put it down, and then after they put their foot on it, release it, etc., in a series of steps. So it appeared to know, they knew what they were doing. So this was the start of it, to check out whether or not they actually could reason. And I won't go through all the steps. I think I described it in A Naturalist at Large. But another interesting thing came out there that, again, it was totally unanticipated and was quite interesting. For example, while having to watch the ravens from up close and being there with them all the time, I saw this. And it might not look very interesting, but what you're seeing is it's licking here, and you see there's sap running down here and here, and this only happens on sunny days where there are cold nights, when there's a huge saturation deficit in the air, when sap evaporates very quickly, and when the sap runs. And if you look closely, what you see on the sugar maple trees is these bites. Here is a lower incisor, an upper incisor, a bite, and then the sap runs down, and it evaporates, and there's syrup then, sugar, and they just lap it up. So that's how I think we learn to do maple sugaring. Okay, so so the fun thing is to look at different species of birds. When I was in Vermont, I really got interested in geese, and there was this pair that nested right there on the pond. I called them Pop and Peep, and I could recognize them after a while by their face masks. And one of them later on I raised. I raised babies, and here is on the right is Peep, the female, and she was hand raised, and she after a year came back with a gander, and this was Pop, and they stayed together, and after Peep kept coming close, the gander would be at first kind of alarmed, but he became gradually more and more tame. And so they adapted even their babies to a dog, get along fine. And a few years later, here is one of the ones that I had raised and hand raised. And people talk about this imprinting stuff. It's a lot of it is baloney. Because certainly they will follow you if you feed them, and if you are their protector, yeah, they'll follow you, and they did, but they still remember that they're geese, the same way as a dog still remembers it's a dog, no matter how much you pet it. And so anyway, here's one. I think this might be Peep. I don't know which one. But, it got loose, and then the Fish and Game Department, they have a roundup of the geese, and they catch hundreds of them where they gather at some ponds after they lose their flight feathers in late summer, and they round them up and band them, and this one got banded, and so it came back. So it's not a wild one, it's one that I had previously, and a couple of years later it still remembers me, and I can go there and touch it and pet it or whatever. It's just pretty amazing. But, that produces empathy, and I could show the students, and they could see it from up close, and they really get interested. And it's fun to have a connection to the wild. And, some connections are from birds naturally by themselves. For example, here I was interested in a sapsucker. Here's a male close up, and here I have an apple tree that a bear was going up there quite a lot and shaking down the apples and breaking the limbs. So I decided to put that flashing at the bottom so he wouldn't climb. And then what happened was a woodpecker would come, a sapsucker, and I was here when it came, and it started drumming here, and this metal flange amplified the sound, and that woodpecker went crazy after that, and he was just hammering, and really, really loud. And I said, wow, what an opportunity to see what would happen now when why do they make all that noise, especially the sapsuckers? Well, what happened was, I thought, well, they probably are attracting females because there was always a male that was doing it. But so even on the first day when when he was really going at it, sure enough, several times a female would come. But as soon as the female came, the male would take off. So why would he take off when the female comes? Well, it turned out that the male would be going to a nest site, either one that's finished or that was starting to be made. And here you see a typical tree, a nest tree. Did I have this? It doesn't work anymore, I think. Oh, here we go. Okay. So anyway, here's a fungus, and it rots the inside, and the woodpeckers use these, and these woodpeckers are not such strong excavators as other woodpeckers because they're sapsuckers. They don't need to go into wood, and so they're not as good as hammering them out. They only have to go through the shell of the tree. And so it's quite valuable for them to reduce the amount of work that they're not very good at. So what happens is a good nest cavity is a huge resource for the raising of the young. And so what the woodpecker was doing was leading the female to a potential nest site. Okay, this is just a little side story of a sapsucker of this last summer. Here is a baby one peeking out of a nest hole. And here you see, okay, this was a nest hole we were looking at, and this was the nest hole of the sapsucker from the year before. It's an older hole, but here, I think this is a male, I can't tell for sure, but he flew up there and started looking in there. And all the time before, he was only here. I says, why would he now look up there? And then I saw why the interest was. And what you see here is a flying squirrel, and you see there is blood. So it turned out that the flying squirrel was getting into the nest hole and eating the babies and removing them, and so that only one was left eventually. And here is the female. Now it's out of the nest. This is the one female, and the baby would follow the male or the female, and here it's making the taps, and that's where the baby would come and learn, presumably, and also feed. Okay, this led to another sapsucker. Here's another one, a baby sapsucker. This is one that I found in the wild. It was it was one that was almost dead. It had starved, and I picked it up, and it couldn't fly, and I knew it was going to die because its flight muscles were atrophied and just about gone. It couldn't fly, so I wanted to try to save it, but I didn't know, how do you feed a baby sapsucker? But I know it needed protein, so I took it home and had some steak and started feeding it. And every time I would feed it, I say beep, 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 so associate that sound. And after a while, the little woodpecker associated that sound with food and would come to me. And after a while, it would even start to call when it was hungry. It'd make that chirring noise like woodpeckers do, baby woodpeckers in the nest. So this was quite an experience, and eventually got it to even, this is a fully grown woodpecker in the wild, and I even got it to take food right out of between my teeth, up against the tree. So here's another example of getting close to nature. This is my cabin, and here a flicker started hammering, making a hole. I says, oh boy. So I knew it was starting to make a nest hole, so I went inside and sawed away a piece of the panel on the other side and provided a bottom there, so when it made through, it had a nest hole, and sure enough it did, and here's a woodpecker looking from the inside out. So I could be on the other side and photograph it. Here I even had, like watching TV, here is the nest hole there, and had usually a blanket over it, and had a piece of board over it, but we could watch it from up close, and see, for example, the set of eggs, and here's a hole up there, and follow the fate of the woodpeckers. Here are the little ones here's a little egg tooth that they're just hatching and scraping the eggs with this little tooth to get out. It looks like here maybe one is just starting. This one is empty. And then later on, here's a hole up there. We could see the woodpecker, the flicker, feeding the babies by reaching down and to see what they feed on. Just take a pipe cleaner and very loosely put it around the neck, and then they can't swallow. And then you take it out, and you just push it out. And here you see there's mostly the pupae of ants, the larvae, and some eggs, and a few adults. So it's feeding almost principally on ants. So what was interesting is that once the young got bigger, they would crowd and intercept the adults at the hole. Here's an adult, can't even get in. Here's the bill of the adult, and these youngsters are trying to get up there, trying to feed. So there was always a war going on between the young to see who was going to get the food. So this is a interesting situation to see, what would happen. Was one going to starve to death or what? So this might be a way of reducing the number of young. There's only a certain number of young could get enough food. And so they could not, lay too many eggs. Okay, so just looking out in the wild, you see things and you sometimes wonder what it is. So here, you might think, well, what do you think it is? Anybody got an idea? Yeah, it looks like a mouse tunnel. Well, but it actually turned not to be a mouse tunnel. If you look really close, you can see a bird track. And it is actually tunnel made by redpolls. About 6 or 7 years ago, there was a big outbreak, what they call eruption of redpolls. And here, they're kind of social birds, and they were would overnight, probably in the far north, under the snow. So it relates to, how they nights when it gets down to minus 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit should be killed, and they have to maintain their body temperature fairly high. But here in the southern area, very often there might be rain, and that would freeze the snow, and they would not be able to get out, and they would then all die. But it's something that would work in the north. So we get the behavior, and I believe it's more or less play. They're doing it in play here, but they probably do it in the north to survive overnight. Here's another bird that is tiny. It's not much bigger than a hummingbird, the golden-crowned kinglet, and always wondered what they would do at night to survive, since, again, they are up in the trees, and I'd never seen them near the ground, but here's a picture of a four-pack. Here's a tail of one, tail of one, tail of one, tail of another one. So it's a four-pack. This was only by climbing up in the tree very, very carefully without flushing them, which was kind of difficult. In the middle of the night, I had seen them fly into the tree and not come out. And so overnighting is important in the north. Here's a ruffed grouse. They feed on buds in the wintertime, and they overnight in making tunnels. Here's the grouse dove into the snow, went under the snow, and here made a peephole, and this is where it come out, and here the wing marks where it left. But this is where it spent the night, and they occasionally make a peephole where they peek out, maybe just before they really settle down. And, by counting the number of droppings, I could tell how long they stayed there, because after looking at hundreds of these, and knowing when they went in and when they come out, I think it was 3.1 droppings per hour or something like that. So there were, 60 or 70 droppings in some of these overnighting places if you took the snow away. But it turned out that most likely it's not just for overnighting to get away from the cold, it's probably also an anti-predator strategy, because it turned out the timing is such that even sometimes I found them under the snow on sunny days when it wasn't cold. So that doesn't jive with just getting away from the cold. And they only foraged in the wintertime, almost in the dark, in the evening and very early in the morning. So this indicates anti-predator strategy as well. So there's not only one reason why they go under the snow, there are at least a couple. And so that explains, why perhaps they have this behavior, because they don't change their feathers into white like some of the Arctic grouse do, the ptarmigan. But maybe up in the north, far north, there isn't that much snow that they can always rely on it. Okay, so here's another example of just keeping track of being at one place for a long time, and you can see changes and make some deductions. So this is a barred owl that showed up one day by the log cabin, and it perched here, and it would come back every day. I mean, every evening, and be there in the morning, and it would. I could feed it by putting food out, and it turned out it would not would throw a mouse out and it wouldn't touch it. And I said, that's funny, they should be taking the mouse. But it wouldn't until, so then I thought, well, maybe they're like a rattlesnake. They go by the warmth. They have the infrared radiation, and they sense, like a rattlesnake does, it catches mice in tunnels. So it would take the mouse and take it on the stove and heat it up and put it back out on the snow. No, owl still wasn't interested, so it wasn't going by the temperature. So then I'd put it on a string and pull it along, and boom, instantly it would jump down. So movement was a trigger. But after it got used to, that I would be feeding it, then it ended up even taking it right out of my hand. So I got a couple of scratches on my fingers once in a while, but usually I would just toss things out. So this owl came every day for a whole winter, and then for 2 years it wasn't seen again. It disappeared, but again, notice this limb here, this limb, and this limb, and this is the same limb. Right, again, notice this is just a close-up. I'll go back again. See there. Whoops, there. So it came back. It came back again this year. So that was great to make this connection by being in one place, which if you weren't there, you would never see something like that. It was an amazing experience, actually, to see owl back again, and it made it very personable. Here's a close-up of it on the first time. That was 3 years ago, and here's a picture just a couple of weeks ago. And here I threw something down, and it came right for me and would pick up the food. So now let's take another bird in the total wild that wasn't tamed. So this is a blue-headed vireo, and I was looking for a nest and found it. Here it's incubating on the nest. Here are the eggs, 4 eggs. And here I wanted to get a picture, and I was able to put a stepladder up there and actually touch it with one finger and take the picture with the other while I'm on the stepladder up there. So this was the most amazing thing I've seen for quite a while of a bird, me being, in being trustful. So it is possible to get close to them sometime. This is another okay, what I wanted to point out, that in the same nest, again, it looked like there was some family control there, because there were 4 eggs, and then there was a period of rain for a week, and the birds were not able to find food, not very much, apparently, because there were no insects around. And 2 eggs were were removed from the nest. I don't think it was a predator, because a predator would have taken the whole thing. They reduced the number of eggs. Here's the nest of a broad-winged hawk, and I just happened to be climbing up there just for the hell of it, and to take a look, but I was totally surprised to see ferns up there, because obviously this fern had just been put there like minutes ago or an hour or so, and it only happened after the young hatched, and continued even until the young were ready to fledge. So here was a very interesting question that creates a puzzle. Why would they do it, put in a nest lining of green after the young hatch? Okay. Now I want to talk briefly about a project that I've been recently on, and actually just been finishing a book on it, which is on tree swallows. These are barn swallows, though, but just for comparison, because I'm going to make comparisons with other swallows. The barn swallows, they nest basically anywhere on beams in a barn or along a house, and you can see that unlike in the woodpecker, any one of the young could potentially be fed because they all can beg together. In comparison with, let's say, a tree swallow who nest in tree holes or bird boxes, where this is a female looking out, but the young can block the entrance, and then only one can be fed at a time, and one strong one could potentially block the entrance and keep the others from feeding, much like in the woodpeckers. And indeed, I found that quite often I would find dead young who were unable to get enough food. They starved to death because the parents could not satiate them all. But the thing that I was interested in was the white feathers in the nest. So here is a nest, and it's with these longest feathers, and I don't know where they came from. And I won't go into the whole story, but just give you a little bit of it here. Here I am feeding the wild swallow. They got, I was watching them all the time, and they got totally habituated to me. And so what you see here is me holding, and here's the swallow coming, taking it out of my hand, and I could test how many feathers they would take at one time, what color they wanted, and how often and when they would do it. And so I did quite a few experiments with that. And the feather question led to many other questions with these very interesting birds. Here's a male peeking out of the nest hole. I could even go into the nest and touch them. Here's a female on the nest. Again, this is due to the fact that this bird box is right next to my door and readily available, and I can make an association with it and get to know it. So always looking for things that stand up out of the environment. And here's actually something that's a little bit different. Here I saw these tracks on the snow, on the first snow this last fall, and one of the tracks is of me running, and the other track is of me walking. So I thought that was very interesting because I just seen an article about Australopithecus afarensis of 3.4 million years ago, the tracks that the Leakeys found in Latoli, and here is a track of this pre-human 3.4 million years ago. And so I think, and they talk about this was the first evidence of bipedal locomotion. So I would say from these tracks, these to me look a lot like running rather than walking. And I would say we were running even at that time rather than just walking. Okay, again, getting close to nature involved getting close to animals, and here is a neighbor friend of mine, Jimmy Adams. When I was a kid, I was not lucky enough to have a skunk, but I did have the crow, and my mother had a monkey, which she brought back from Angola, and this was, the monkey would always, ride on her shoulder, even when she went downtown and grocery shopping, and would hang with there. But once in a while it would jump off and jump on somebody else's neck, which usually raised quite a ruckus. My father was also very close to nature. Here he is. This is a real bear. It's not a teddy bear. And here is my daughter Lena with a herring gull chick, you see the delight of having something close and seeing it and actually feeling it. And here you see a hominin, a human, with a lagomorph and with a rodent and with a canid. Getting close to nature means really getting close, and that's what it takes. And we should not separate us from nature, but get close to it. So in my winter ecology class, we have each student makes a little study in their week at the cabin in the wintertime. And here Zoe Cowett was looking at the effect of nature on college students' well-being. So comparing comments of making questions that require either a positive or a negative answer, and seeing how that would, the survey would distinguish between time spent outdoors or indoors back in Burlington. Anyways, I won't go over all the results, but as you might expect, they did another study, which I also won't mention the same thing, but both of them found a lot of positive effect in being out in contact with nature, and a lot more negative when they got back to Burlington and the university. And here, I'll end with this. They write in my remembrance book, a memoir there, and about what they usually impresses them. And here is Olivia. She says, "This week reminded me of wonder's essential place in science, and winter will never be the same. Warmly, Olivia." Okay. Thank you very much.